We usually think of countries, especially rivals, as having these totally separate, unique histories, right? Forged by their own culture, their own decisions. But what if that's not the whole story? What if, hiding in plain sight, there are these powerful patterns that connect them all? So let's just jump right in with a really provocative question. Is it possible that countries as wildly different as Russia, Iran, and the United States are all, in a way, reading from the same historical script? I know, it sounds a little crazy, but the evidence is actually pretty amazing. And the key that unlocks this whole idea comes from this one remarkable document. You can think of it like a historical playbook. It basically lays out these shared patterns, these rhythms, across three nations we normally think of as being worlds apart. So we're going to walk through it pattern by pattern, and you can see for yourself just how deep these connections really go. All right, first up, the political pendulum. In any country, there's this constant back and forth struggle over who's really in charge and how power should be used. It's a tug of war that, as we're about to see, just never seems to end. So this first pattern is a classic tug of war that you see pretty much everywhere. On one side, you've got this drive to build a powerful central government that calls all the shots. But on the other side, you have all these forces trying to pull that power away, out to the regions or the states or local groups. It's a really fundamental tension in how you run a country. And you see this exact same dynamic playing out in these three very different places. Russia's history swings wildly between an iron-fisted central government and, well, total chaos and collapse. Iran's story is one of massive, unifying empires that eventually break apart into squabbling dynasties. And the U.S.? I mean, our entire story, from the Federalist Papers all the way to the Civil War, is this exact battle between federal power and states' rights. And that leads us right into the next rhythm. For every action, there's a reaction. A country will have this huge burst of reform, modernizing, opening up. And it almost always triggers this massive backlash from people who feel like their whole way of life is being threatened. For example, look at Russia. The sweeping reforms under Tsar Alexander II were immediately followed by the super reactionary policies of his son. In Iran, decades of pushing for Western-style modernization led directly to the explosion of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And in the United States, the huge social changes of the 1960s civil rights era were met head-on by the rise of a powerful conservative backlash in the 70s and 80s. See the pattern? Okay, so we've talked about the political pendulum. Now let's go a layer deeper. Let's move away from just government and talk about the cultural cracks inside these societies. These deep societal fault lines that can shape a country for hundreds of years. And here's a huge one, the battle between tradition and modernization. Each of these nations is constantly torn. Do they embrace Western modernity, or do they double down on their own unique heritage? In Russia, you had the Slavophiles. In Iran, you have religious orthodoxy. In the US, a really strong strain of religious traditionalism. They're all, in their own way, pushing back against the tide of global change. And right alongside that is this other endless debate. What is the proper role of religion in society? It's a constant, and let's be honest, often messy negotiation over where you draw the line between the state and the influence of faith. And the struggle just plays out in such fascinatingly different ways. Russia saw the Orthodox Church get brutally crushed by the Soviets, only to come roaring back as a major political force after 1991. Iran's revolution, of course, did the opposite. It fused religion and state together to create a modern theocracy. And the US? Well, we were founded on a secular constitution, but we've always had this powerful influence from faith-based movements shaping our politics. And finally, here's a fault line that I bet feels instantly familiar: the city versus the countryside. You have the urban centers, which tend to be more liberal, more plugged into global culture, and on the other side, you have the rural areas, which are often the strongholds of tradition and conservatism. This one divide right here probably explains more about the politics of all three countries than you'd think. All right, for our last theme, let's zoom way out. Let's look at the big picture. These are the grand cycles of a nation's mood, its own story about itself. It's about its sense of destiny and its place in the world, which, it turns out, can rise and fall just like the stock market. And here we see this national mood swing playing out on the world stage. Do we go out and project power, or do we pull back and focus on ourselves? All three of these nations have bounced between periods of aggressive expansion, think of the Russian Empire or American Manifest Destiny, and then periods of turning inward, wanting nothing to do with foreign problems. Then, of course, there's the economic rhythm of boom and bust. This one is universal, right? The US has seen it with the Great Depression and the dot-com bust. Russia went through an absolutely devastating depression in the 1990s after the Soviet collapse. And Iran's entire modern history has been shaped by the wild boom and bust cycles of the oil market. And that economic cycle feeds a really powerful psychological one. It's this belief many nations have that they are somehow exceptional, that they have a special destiny. But that soaring confidence can flip in an instant to a period of deep self-doubt, of national humiliation. And those crises often become the very things that spark the next big change. You see this cycle so clearly in each country. Russia has this historic sense of being the third Rome, which clashes directly with the memory of its humiliation after the Cold War. Iran draws on the incredible pride of its ancient Persian empires to push back against a history of being pushed around by foreign powers. And the U.S. ideal of being a city upon a hill has been shaken to its core by crises like the Civil War in Vietnam, only to be reborn again later. So, after looking at all these parallels, you have to ask the big question, so what? Why does this even matter? What's the point of looking at history through this lens of repeating patterns? Well, it makes you think of that great line usually credited to Mark Twain: history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And that's exactly it. The specific details are always different. The leaders change, the technology changes, but the underlying structures, those deep political and social rhythms, those are what rhyme across centuries and across borders. So, what should we take away from all this? First, that countries you think are completely different can actually share these incredibly deep historical rhythms. Second, these core struggles, like centralization versus fragmentation or tradition versus modernity, are shockingly persistent. And finally, this whole pattern perspective gives us a powerful new way to understand the world. It suggests that a lot of what we see in the headlines today isn't really new. It's just the latest echo of a very old, very deep conversation that country has been having with itself for a long, long time. And that just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. If history really does have these rhythms, these repeating beats, what beat do you think comes next?